Good morning, everybody. Today is May 18th. This is episode 101, the first one in the new century. I don't know what the generic term is for 100. The centarium. Anyways, welcome back to What the Hell is Water. I'm Reed Garcia, the founder and CEO of Helpful for Life. So if you have a life, we can be helpful for it. So yesterday we had a special day because it was episode 100 for us. And so we wanted to make sure to celebrate and be grateful. So that's what our episode yesterday was about, a little bit about gratitude and celebration. And of course, per us, let's be real, we talked about all sorts of other things. I had all sorts of fun tangents and all sorts of exciting other topics that we discussed. We ended up referencing Bo Burnham's Inside. We talked about our CGK cooks that we had back at the beginning of last year, our first foray into live streaming. We reflected on the journey that we've had over the last few months. We said what some of our things that we were grateful for with the show. We talked. I've got a frog in my throat today. Hold on. There was a reference to Old Greg, which is a BBC video that is funny on YouTube. We plugged Mike Myers' new show, The Pentaverate, that somehow came into play, and yeah, I think that's that's probably a pretty good little quick summary of what we talked about yesterday. And of course, we emphasized how we love to fail forward. We've been doing it from the beginning of the show, and we'll continue to do it going forward. Then later throughout the day, we actually conducted our first AMA, our first Ask Me Anything. And we did that both on Reddit, the platform. So we'll share a link to that below. Let me make sure that I get that into our thing. And then also, we, as part of, AMAs on Reddit are typically just text-based, but since we do live video, we made sure to add in some video to that. And so we actually started out around lunchtime and we made homemade Chick-fil-A nuggets from scratch. And they were very tasty, although we both decided after the fact they didn't exactly taste that much like a Chick-fil-A nugget. And, we attributed it to the fact that Danielle is a lot loosier with the ingredients and proportions than I am. And so I think if you want to get something that's really close to what that restaurant is doing, I highly recommend following someone who's done the repetitive recipe testing and found what those ratio are to get that exact kind of taste. But if you're like Danielle, and honestly more, I'm kind of like this too, but she's especially like this, if you just want something that's easy to cook and is kind of like the thing, then that's pretty much what we achieved. But the Chick-fil-A sauce, we definitely nailed that one. That one's super easy. And you can make it probably with ingredients you already have in your house. You just kind of squirt a couple things in and mix it up. So you'd be surprised how easy it is to get something that's pretty close to that. So that was yesterday, and you can go to that AMA link in the Reddit and ask us any questions still. Well, that thing's going to be there forever, and we'll gladly keep answering questions on there because that's one of my favorite things to do is answer questions from you guys and help make sure that I'm helping you. One, if there are any questions that I can help with you in your life specifically, of course, that's a great spot to ask them. Or if you're curious about me or our company or this journey or anything like that, we've got plenty of things to talk about. 101 episodes in, I'm sure you guys know that if there's one thing that I can do, it's talk, for better or worse. So that is it for our recap and plug of yesterday. Our challenge yesterday, which is the thing I almost forgot. It was actually kind of a two-part thing. It was one was to participate in the AMA, come watch or come hang out. And then the other one was to reflect on something within the last year that you are grateful for and or that you wanted to celebrate. So that was something that we thought. Actually, yeah, we had a viewer write a question, which was something along those lines, targeted at us, and we thought it was a good question. So we wanted to turn that right back around to you guys. Make sure you guys were reflecting. Make sure you guys are celebrating, and because it's a very, very important thing to do, and being grateful. So without further ado, let's hop in to that intro. Helpful for life. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is What the Hell is Water? It is episode 101. Today is Wednesday, Hump Day, May 18th, 2022. And today we are talking about survivor bias. Now, of course, I had to have a little bit of fun with survivor bias with the thumbnail because it made me think of the Destiny's Child song, I'm a Survivor. If Danielle is here, I'm sure she would sing it for you. It also made me think of the TV show Survivor, which honestly, I would not be surprised if is one of the longest running TV shows now, or at least the most number of seasons. I think they're over 40, which is kind of crazy. I remember we were watching that 20 years ago probably. That thing's impressive that it still survived. So anyways, survivor bias, I'm not going to tell too much about it, but because we have someone in the wings waiting for us to tell us all about it. So we're going to go ahead and bring her on. We have Alexandra Mannering's back, a favorite repeat guest who knows all things data analytics. So let us bring her on. And 1 second, press my buttons. And here we go. Oh, hello. You look a little grayer than normal. There you go. I forgot to press the other button. Good morning, Alexandra. Good to see you.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Good. It's very nice to see you. It's been a couple months now, so
Yeah.
glad to see you're still alive and kicking.
I'm still hearing hold music, which I'm happy to listen to during our conversation.
Thank you.
But
That should stop
that's better.
Thank you for pointing that out. I wonder if that's been going the whole time.
No, it just started.
Okay, good. All right, perfect. Thank you. So, good morning, and how are you doing now that you can actually listen to me?
Yeah, no, we're doing great. Thank you so much. And I've got an addition here. She's less enamored with cartoons, so I can't bribe her to stay out of my office.
Darn. Even if you put on Tom and Jerry, huh?
Exactly, yeah. Well, and maybe potentially because the kids are watching Paw Patrol, and so maybe it's like extra, not her thing.
Nice. Well, hey, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So when it comes to survivor bias, maybe we should first start off with a rough definition. So what is survivor bias?
So survivor bias is a type of sampling bias where you are trying to make some kind of understanding or extrapolation or interpretation or conclusion about an entire group, an entire universe, right, of people or objects, and you can only look at some of them. And survivor bias happens when some of them that you're looking at are not random from the whole population because some of them haven't made it to the point where you sampled. And so survivor bias can be literally survival bias, right? So if you interview soldiers coming home and you're like, what was the worst part about being at war? You're not getting a full representation of all soldiers' experiences. You're only talking to soldiers who actually survived the war to come home. So that would be survivor bias. And there's a great famous example with a gentleman named Abraham Wald, who was one of those great examples of Germany's self-defeating antics in World War II, where they chased out all of the brilliant Jews out of their country. And so here this Jewish statistician shows up in America and gets recruited because, of course, the Allies had a problem, which is their planes kept getting shot down by the fierce Luftwaffe. The Germans had an amazing air force, and their planes just kept getting shot down and shot down and shot down. And I loved that they said, okay, you know who we need to help us solve this? A statistician. And so they went to Wald, and really he wasn't even a formal statistician. He was a mathematician who had learned a lot of these statistical techniques. And so they said, what do? We need to figure out how to get our planes to stay in the air. And so, a lot of the engineers were like, well, we need to armor the planes better. But armoring the entire plane would have made the plane too heavy to actually be of any use. If I had no range, wouldn't have been maneuverable. So they said we can only put some armor on. So where do we put it? And again, in a brilliant stroke of insight, they collected data on where their planes were getting hit. So every plane that came back, they mapped exactly where the bullet holes were. And they brought that data to Abraham Wald and they said, okay, we know where all the bullets are hitting. And he looked at this. And what was so cool is you look at the patterns, and you can Google this and you can see it. And it is pretty impressive that there's clearly a pattern to where these planes were getting shot, and you could see them clustering around the wings and kind of on some of the parts of the tail, and there were almost no shots right in like the center part of the fuselage or in the cockpit. And so like our gut instinct when we look at that is put armor where all the bullets are. And Abraham Wald's brilliant insight was no, you put armor where the bullets aren't, because right, we're looking at a sample of planes that came back. So this is survivor bias. We don't have all of the planes that got shot down. And in fact, that's what we're trying to prevent. So we want to do the opposite. We know that the planes that aren't being included in our sample are the ones that got shot down. And so therefore, the non-random distribution is actually the opposite of what we think, right? Clearly, all the planes that came back riddled with these bullet holes, planes can survive getting shot there. Right. So we don't care if they get shot there. And what we want to do is armor the places that we're not seeing returning planes get shot. And even if you're not a military engineer, survivor bias is really important to understand, because a lot of the conclusions that we try to make from looking at data, we're taking an existing sample and trying to make conclusions about what happened in the past. And anytime you do that, there's a chance that the sample you're looking at now, the group of people you're talking to now, the group of objects that you're working with now, right, has had a certain subset of them removed from the population for one reason or another, and therefore they're not represented in what you're trying to make conclusions about.
Yeah, no, I do think that's such a great example, right? And it's, I think, the quintessential survivor bias for a reason, right? Especially because it has that military thing and it has the literal survivor aspect to it. So I do think it's important, as you just mentioned, to emphasize, like, it's not all just about literal life and death.
Right.
It's just, that's the term. It's called survivor bias. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I was going to say, like, another great example is that if you were to interview all graduating seniors, and you're like, tell us your study methods, and then you tried to make a conclusion about effectiveness of study methods, you have a survivor bias problem, which is everyone who didn't make it to graduation is not included in your sample.
Right.
And so that's an example of, like, they didn't die. That's why they didn't make it to graduation, but they dropped out. They didn't persist in college or in high school. And so that's another great example where you're going to get skewed results because you're only looking at those that made it to the point at which you sampled.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And then with the other thing I wanted to point out is I feel like survivor bias combined with just insufficient data, and I don't know if there's a term for it, but using anecdotal data and pretending that it's like larger than it is. I feel like between whatever that term is that I just made up and survivor bias, those are probably two of the things average people are most guilty of, right? When we were talking about this earlier, you were telling me it's like, oh, well, someone says like, well, I didn't wear a seatbelt and I'm still here. Or, I'm sure plenty of people heard with COVID, with masks and vaccines and all that kind of stuff, similar types types of things, right? So very easy to say in the real world, well, based on my experience or based on what so and so did, they are fine. So
Right. And that's a great example of both literal and figurative survival bias, that if you're talking about like, well, clearly this thing wasn't dangerous because I'm here. Well, all the people who didn't make it aren't here to tell me that.
mm-hmm.
And so I like very literally, I'm only going to get that the survivor point of view. But even again, for other things, like if you're talking to like executive leadership, and they're like, well, I don't see a problem with our promotion path.
Right.
Like, that's because you're an executive. So the path worked for you. Like, you survived that process. So I don't really care if you think it works for you. Like, what we need to find out is all the people who didn't make it to, being an executive, why did they drop out? And I'm not going to find that talking to the people who are already executives.
Right. Which is another example of if you want to think about broader like societal impacts and things like that, that's a very common thing where like, to be stereotypical, right? The straight white man in upper middle class doesn't get why all of these things, there's like, what's wrong with these things? It's like, well, that's because you're maybe in that having that survivor bias thing, because you made it through, you got through those systems, you did those things. You don't see all the other things and all of the people and stuff that didn't make it past all those checkpoints. So yeah, I think this is an important one. So, okay, so we know roughly what survivor bias is. I don't know if you want to dive into a specific example or if you want to say how to know when it's going to happen, or where would you like to go from here?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really want to talk about first is like, why does this matter? Because again, you're like, well, I'm not a statistician. I'm not going to be running these samples. Like, why do I have to care if I'm, just listening to the news or talking to my friends? And you brought up that the combination of survivor bias with over reliance on our own personal experience or anecdotes of those people who, we're close to and we talk to. And I think that understanding where your information comes from and where it can be applied to is really important. And so understanding the concept of survivor bias to me opens up this conversation about, can I take the conclusion that we're making about this sample, right? This group of people we surveyed, this set of test results, whatever it is, can we apply that to the whole population? And if not, like, who does this conclusion apply to, and who might this conclusion leave out, right? Where I can't actually have any insight about a certain group of people because they weren't part of the analysis. And there's an amazing woman named Heather Kraus, and she runs a company called We All Count. And she has a poster on her wall when she does video chats that say maps only show the people who aren't invisible to the map maker.
Interesting.
And I think that survivor bias and a lot of the other sampling errors that are very closely related are a great example of, it's very easy to forget those who aren't represented in your data or in your sample or in your conclusion, and then you over apply the results. So there's nothing wrong with surveying existing executives as long as you only apply those conclusions to other existing executives or people who are very similar, in lived experience and in whatever the factors are that you measured, to the people who are those current executives. But we as humans have a knee-jerk reaction. Like our instinctive thing is to then say, well, that applies to all people.
Right.
And that it's that jump that causes the problem.
Yeah.
And so that's the one that I really would love people to think about, is whether it's a story that someone tells you and then you turn around and you try to apply that story to someone who's nothing like the person that just told it to you, right? Like, oh, okay, well, this worked for my friend, so clearly it's going to work for my 5-year-old. Like, maybe not, right? Like, yes. At that, what was her experience? What was it that went into that? To these bigger conclusions of like, I read it in the news, that insert whatever news clip they put in and they're talking about this finding. Does that really apply to me? Does that apply to the groups that I'm part of or not? Because are we represented in whatever drove those conclusions?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of, some common ways this might come up in an average person's life. And, there's a lot of different ways it could come up, but diet is a big one. Say, oh, you should eat this way or do this way because I lost weight or I got healthier this way, and it's like, well, maybe that worked because of their specific needs, right? That's a
Yeah.
important thing to keep in mind. Do you
Well,
have any
and
other? Go ahead.
diets have a great survivor bias as well, because oftentimes in those studies, it's only people who persist with the diet.
Ah,
So
yes.
like it might work if you can handle, like, oh, we're going to do, what is it, intermittent fasting.
Mm-hmm.
And then you find these amazing results at the end. And it's because 50% of people dropped out because they couldn't handle not eating for
Right.
2 days a week or whatever it is. And I'm making up those numbers. Please do not quote me on those numbers. But my point being that you can't report results on people who don't stay in the study.
Right.
So through no fault of the scientists, running the study, people are going to drop out and not participate. We don't live in a world where you get to just force people to do scientific studies. And so your conclusions are going to be based on people who can stick with the diet. And so again, you'd need to look at it, be like, is this something I could actually carry out? Because if I'm not going to stick with it, I'm not going to get the results regardless of how wonderful they are.
Mm-hmm. And I'll add one caveat to your phrase that we don't live in a world where we can force people to participate in studies. We don't live in a country where you can force people to participate.
Well, anymore, because we have been guilty of that in the past.
Yes, very true.
Fortunately, no longer live in a country where we can do that. And I'm happy to take the hit to science to have that freedom.
Yes. Yeah. No, it was just the other day I was reminded of a study that was done by the government where it was the government subjected a certain number of African American people to experience syphilis or something, some similar disease.
They deliberately infected them. Well, hang on, I'm gonna have that wrong. They withheld medical treatment.
Right, to see how the disease played out.
Withheld medical treatment from, Yeah. And I think they were soldiers.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that part, but that is an example of people who were subjected to an experiment.
They were unwillingly subjected to a scientific experiment, and that's there's a whole other thing about the history of science that's an example of things that undermines a community's trust in the medical system and in science. And so when they look at it and say, really, we're going to believe what you came out with, like, it's not just about facts to be able to convince people. You have to build a culture of trust, and that's based on like reciprocity and respect and ethical treatment of people. And so, but it did lead to creation of now the scientific community has institutional review boards that review any human subject research. And they say, like, do we think that this is ethical to do with people? And so, yes, there were good changes that came out of it, but there's a lot to repair there.
Right. And a couple things on that. One, I want to make sure to plug our previous episode where we talked about what can go wrong with science, right? Because we talked about some of these factors. But also I want to point out, especially if you're in that subgroup, that survivor group, especially if you're in we'll just say the white majority, you may not understand why a lot of these minority communities don't trust science and don't trust the government. And it's because you're like, I don't really get it. Why don't you do it? Why don't you get it? Well, it's because of all of these historical things, which you may or may not know about, but they lived those things and they've experienced those things to, like you said, they broke that trust. And so therefore it's taking a lot of time and effort to repair that trust. And people are wary. So it makes sense, right? But it's easy to not feel that way because you're not in their shoes, right? So it's another great thing we love to talk about here is shift your lens and try and put yourself in their shoes and think about, okay, why are they thinking that way, and is there any merit to that, and what can we do to help move everyone in that direction, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's why I think understanding something like survivor bias is so important, because even when it's not intentional, right? If you've set up your research or you're reading information or surveys about a non-random subset of people, it's still biased, even if it's not intentional. Okay. Can you give me 1 second
yes,
to put
please,
a
go
show
for
on?
it. Yeah, no worries. So when it comes to survivor bias, it's one of those things that when you first hear it, you're like, survivor. I don't know. This doesn't really apply to me. I don't have anything to do with war or death or any of these types of things. But as you guys have heard here today, like it's first off, it's not just about literal physical survival of, but it's about has something made it to the end of whatever it may be, whether it was a diet trial. Obviously, we mentioned some examples that actually involved combat, and Alexandra brought up another good example of making changes within a company or an organization based on what the people who are still there, and you're forgetting all the people who either quit or were fired or who are no longer with that organization, or at least not in the room. Because one of the biggest things is with survivor bias is the data does not have a voice in the conversation, or in some cases the person does not have a voice in the conversation because they literally are not there, right? Whether that means they passed or they just didn't pass those checks to keep going on through the end of that study, if you will. So Alexandra, we've given a definition of survivor bias. We've given a couple of examples. We talked a little bit about why it's important. What else should we touch on here?
Well, I think that there's a lesson for how we get our own information as well. There are a lot of like gatekeeping in how we get our information. My computer just froze.
Okay, yeah, you froze for a second. I can still hear you, but your video is frozen. Oh, it's coming back. I think you're good now. Can you hear me, Alexandra? Well, let's give her a second to figure that out, and we will be right back.
All works. It just everything's frozen for me. Although I'm not going to be able to hear what you respond, but I can at least answer this question.
Okay, go for it then.
What I was going to say is that understanding survivor bias and sampling bias, I think, can really strongly influence how you gather your own information. So one, it should inform your actual interpretation of scientific results. So again, you're listening to the news, someone comes up on the radio, they talk about whatever it is. And you want to question, what kind of people are those data drawn from? What kind of groups are in that study and what kind of groups are not? But at a more personal level, it should also make you question who you talk to, what you read on Reddit, what you find on Facebook, what how you consume that information from all around you, because there's survivor bias in that as well. All the social media platforms have algorithms that feed you things that are similar to the stuff that you already consume. And so you've got survivor bias where there are stories that are not like the ones that you consume currently that are going to get filtered out. They won't make it to you for you to be able to read or to listen to or hear from. And so you are getting a non-random subset. And this phrase non-random is really important because it means that there are groups that are consistently left out. So there's perspectives that are left out from the information that you consume. There are stories that are left out from the information that you consume. And so when you make conclusions about how the world works or how people experience it, that means that those conclusions that you are drawing and that understanding of the lived experience around you or how the world works, it is suffering from sampling bias, because there are experiences and insights and people and stories that are not making it to you. And you can fix this by deliberately identifying them and seeking them out, right? So, you know what? I don't actually hear that many stories from people on the opposite political spectrum of me. I am going to go seek those stories out and hear from those people what they think about the world. And I'm not saying you go hang out in extreme alt-right or extreme alt-left, places, but find respected people in communities that aren't your circles and just hear what they have to say, or just follow life experiences of people who live different lives than you. If you have a desk job and you have your suburban house with your white picket fence, try instead listening just to a podcast or a life story or a vlog, or read a blog from somebody who is a mountain climber, or is a tow truck rescue driver. There's an amazing YouTube channel about a guy who's a tow truck rescue driver. Follow one of the amazing small farm YouTube channels. Learn about where your food comes from. Like, just expose yourself to things that are not normal for your lived experience. So with that, let me reboot my screen to see if it'll come back so that I can hear you, and maybe that'll give you something. You can talk about the things that I just shared, and I'll come right back in.
Yes. So thanks so much to Alexandra for doing that. So while she reboots, I think that was a great take and a great example of how we can apply survivor bias and how we can make sure that we're removing that from our lives. So perfect. You're back and you're clear again. So we can still hear you. You're a little fuzzy, but I was just telling the audience that I love that angle. I think that's a really good way to think about it and to recognize, like, hey, you aren't hearing the voices of people who aren't in the room with you. And sometimes that's literally figuratively. But I'm so glad you pointed out the larger picture, which is we are all fed feeds of information every day. It's from, like you said, Facebook, but even in our Google searches, it's easy to forget, people, but your Google search is tailored to you. It's based on where you literally are at that moment. It's based on your search history. It's based on things that you've clicked on in the past. Different ads are shown to you based on who you are. Like, all of these things affect your view of the world. And the thing is about where we are as a society and as a world is we haven't even truly realized the impact of these decisions because it's never been like this before. We've never had it where a handful of companies are influencing the lives of billions of people. Literally, the entire world is being influenced by the decisions that a handful of people are making. And even though some if you want to have the positive view on things, the people within those companies want the best and are trying to make the world a better place and things like that. If you want, and of course you could have the more cynical look where these people, all they care about is making money and that kind of thing. But regardless of what view you have on that, the decision that these people are making, these programmers are making, are affecting how we live our everyday lives. And so it's very important to recognize that is the world we live in. And so by realizing, hey, these are things I don't normally hear about, these are people I don't normally hear from, and making a point to go out of your way to find those people, to hear those stories, I think is extremely valuable. And the nice thing about the world that we live in today and the internet is that you can find stories from literally every single walk of life.
Easier than any other time in history. You can get those stories.
Yes, and also I think it's a great point to point out that places are so much more diverse than they've ever been. That's a beauty of the internet. That's the beauty of people being able to work remotely now, people being able to move all over the place. I mean, I grew up in McKinney, Texas, which is pretty stereotypical suburbia, largely a lot of white people and largely a lot of people from Texas. However, over the last 20 years, especially within the last 5-10 years, there's been a huge influx of people into Texas and into the Dallas area. And now in the same city where I grew up, I live in an apartment downtown, and I can go to an event at my apartment, and I'm meeting somebody from Brazil, I'm meeting someone from Greece, I'm meeting somebody who grew up in inner city Chicago, I'm meeting someone who was a flower child in the 60s. The diversity is easier to find than it's ever been. A lot of times in person, especially if you live near a major city. But if you can't find it in person, you can go online. There's plenty of places for you to find this info.
And the fun thing that happens when you do that is that people go from being them and a kind of nameless, faceless enemy or outsider to then people that you recognize, you hear their stories, you know what they're like, and now they're not a them. It's just different, pieces of people. Like, you learn what it actually might be like to be a police officer or to be in jail or to be, right? Like, you recognize that these are humans too with lived experiences that might not be like yours, but they're a human like you. And I think that is one of the best ways to nurture compassion and to recognize, that we have a lot more in common than we have different. And that's the way it's supposed to be.
And I'm so glad you brought up the consumption of information angle, because I hadn't thought about that at all. But I think this is I'll go ahead and make this the challenge for today is, hey, look at where you are getting your information and say, hey, is this source of information taking into account survivor bias? Are they making sure to go out of their way to include the voices and perspectives of people from the other side, or the people who aren't in the room to be present for that conversation? Or are they not? And even worse, if they're not, are they going as far as creating that us versus them mentality, going to that tribalism, which, by the way, goes to our caveman brain, which says, hey, they're not us. We need to defend ourselves. We need to be fearful of them. And so, I'm not going to throw the whole network under. I'm not going to throw under the bus. That was the phrase I was looking for. But I know, for example, a very popular Fox guy is Tucker Carlson, and maybe messed up his name a little bit, but when I've watched a couple of clips from him and I just look at it, I'm like, okay, just put aside that this is from the right. It could be from the left. I honestly don't care. How are they presenting this information? And what are they trying to accomplish? And if you look at the language they're using, it's very much us versus them. It's very much, let me get you riled up. Let me get you angry. Let me get you mad. And let me get you on edge. And guess what? If you're stressed out, that's maybe part of it too, because that, and again, I don't care about which side of the angle it's being presented. I just don't want, and I don't think it's good for people to be hearing it in that way.
Yeah, and I would argue it's going to be nearly impossible for a single source to actually present all the views. So you don't even have to ask, like, is my source of information giving me everybody, or is there a sampling bias? The answer is there's a sampling bias.
Right.
Like, it's just going to be. Let's just assume that. Because there is not a single news station out there that is truly representative of everybody, in part just because there's a limited amount of information that one news source is going to present. And you've got a single editor who's making, a chief editor who's going to be making decisions about that. And that person is going to have blind spots. Again, no matter how much we try, and I think we can reduce it, I think there are people that are worse than others in terms of the narrowness of their view, but a single source is always going to leave something out. And so I would instead challenge you to say, how many different sources are you getting from? And then, so list out all the sources you get information from. And then say, what proportion of the time do you disagree? Or are you confused by? Or are you surprised by the information that comes from those sources? And if let's say you have 15 sources, great, but 90% of the time you agree with, or you go, of course that happened, then you're not getting a mixed view. So that would be my challenge, is say, okay, can I start adding a few sources of information again, whether it's YouTube channels or podcasts or things like that, find websites and blogs from people who are different than you. And you should feel uncomfortable sometimes reading some stuff. And not all the time. I'm not saying be like horrified because you're reading some extremist, whatever. But I'm saying like you should go, I don't agree with that. Or wait, what? That happened? Right. I didn't realize that that's what happened when this thing goes down, that you should have that feeling of learning something new or being exposed to something new. Otherwise, you're getting what you already think.
Yeah, and I would really encourage people, as you're doing this, and also as you're going through life as a whole, but specifically as you're doing this, come from a place of curiosity and accept that, hey, you're wrong on some things. Like, again, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Kind of like you were saying, whether or not there's bias. There is bias.
There is.
Regardless of where you go. Just like, I don't care who you are wrong on some issues. And I think that's one of the problems is we are so afraid of being wrong or so afraid of failing, especially if they're things that we've, really put our stake in the ground of this is what we believe and this is what is right. And especially when things like morality and religion get involved, because it questions your core being. You're like, oh, but this is what I believe so hard. And for example, in Texas, there's a lot of discussion going on right now around abortion and stuff like that, and I know there's a lot of people who feel really strongly about that, but regardless of what the issue is, I really encourage you to come from a place of curiosity. If nothing else, you can learn a little bit more about the other person's view, what they're coming from, and who knows, maybe your perspective will shift a little bit. Another point I want to make is, again, with most of these complex issues that people feel very strongly about, it's not a yes or no answer. It's a spectrum, right? And so even if you're at 1 and the other person's all the way at 0, like, you can likely find yourself moving a little bit more towards that person, or at the very least being able to understand and have compassion for those people who may not think the same way you do. And again, that's one of the great things about America is, and it's interesting to see how this is going to change as the world goes forward. But that's where you have the states, and the states have their different laws. So if you believe one thing about gun control, you're going to probably live in one set of states. If you believe another thing, you're probably going to live in some different sets of states. So yeah, there's a lot of really good things there. Real quick question for you, Alexandra: is it survivor bias, survivorship bias, or kind of either one of those okay?
Yeah, either. I think there's two phrases. Probably the formal name is survivorship bias, but that sounds a little awkward to me. Yeah, so a lot of us just call it survivor bias.
I like survivor bias as well. So,
but yes, okay, the formal term is survivorship.
Any other last few things you think that we should make sure the audience hears around survivor bias?
I think the last piece as well is, like, again, I'm a scientist, right? I do a lot of, like, the technical methods, and one of the things that's really important about, like, the whole thing of, like, survivor bias is being transparent in how you collected your data. So again, it goes back to the fact that, like, there is always bias, but being transparent about where your sampling bias might come from, who might not be represented in a sample or in a research paper or in a news story. I think the more that we can transparently share the biases that we find, the better off that we'll be. Because again, it's not that we should all, mea culpa, I'm biased, it's terrible, because we have to be. That's the only way we can get through the world. And I think we've talked about that on other episodes. But again, whether you're actually in some kind of control over sharing information, and you can actually add that transparency, right? Whether it's a simple survey that you do, whether it's, you're doing the annual HR survey at your company, right? And you look at it, did you get 100% of people in your company represented? Did everyone answer the survey? And if not, the people who didn't, are they random? Is that a non-random group? Or is it, that you've left out a group that should be represented, but for some reason doesn't feel safe sharing information? So wherever we can be transparent about these gaps, right? Or where our biases are, who's getting left out of the story, I think the more, and again, being transparent with yourself, who's getting left out of the information I'm consuming. The more that we can do that, I think the more that we'll be comfortable with the fact that it happens, and the more that we can do things to fix it.
Yeah, I think that's great. And one of the things that popped in my head was here in Texas, the census is an interesting time because we have a lot of undocumented immigrants and people who maybe have just gotten their green cards and things like that, and they're very scared about being deported or having their thing revoked. And so I know that's a big thing, even though for those who aren't aware, like, that's not what the census is about. And I believe there are protections in place to help make it safe for people to report who they are without being at risk of anything happening to them. But again, when it comes to the trust of the government and things like that, it's natural. It's like, well, one, what am I gaining too by putting myself at risk? And two, like, why would I trust these people when I've had all these bad stories, right? So,
well, and that's one thing that I have to say for the census that is so cool is, like, that is one of the understanding the dangers of sampling. The census says we actually are going to try to count literally every single person. We're not going to sample. We're going to actually try to say, can we count every single person so that we understand, who makes up our country. So that's the other way you can get through sampling bias, is if you can actually get every single person. But even within the census, there's some subsets of questions that they ask a much smaller group of people. But that is kind of a cool thing that they are trying to say, we're going to get the entirety of the population so that every person counts.
Yeah, no, I like that. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And for those of you, this is your first time seeing Alexandra is kind of our data analytics expert. She has a company called Miraculous, and she has a podcast called Heart, Soul, and Data. And she's all about helping small businesses and nonprofits figure out data analytics so they can do what they want to do and accomplish the things they want to accomplish. It may be one of those things you're like, I don't know if we can afford that, or I don't know if we should spend money on it, but it is, and you should. So Alexandra, is there maybe a recent episode of the podcast that you'd like to suggest for people to check out?
So I did one on confirmation bias, which again I think is one that's very approachable for everybody. This isn't just about, if you're trying to set up your nonprofit CRM or something like that. The episode on confirmation bias I thought was really interesting because we did talk a lot about how we perceive the world and how that influences our interpretation of data. And then I did another one where I actually got to interview Heather Krause, which I was over the moon about. That was like the most amazing thing. And she talks a lot about transparency in the decisions that we make about science and analytics. So again, it's interesting because I think it calls into question a lot of the ways that we do science and how we can be better about it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. We shared a link to that in the chat, and we will also post a link to the playlist of all of the episodes, What the Hell is Water, that Alexandra has been on. So, Alexandra, with that, you have a wonderful rest of your hump day.
Thank
Tell
you.
your cats and your kids that I said hello, and we will see you next time.
All right, take care.
All right, man, that was very interesting and had a lot of good stuff in there, and a couple of different angles that I hadn't necessarily thought about when it came to survivor bias. So just a quick recap. Survivor bias is the thing that happens when you're looking at a set of data or a set of people, but it's an incomplete set because you aren't looking at all of the things that did not survive, that did not make it all the way to that point. The classic example that is often given is the one that Alexandra opened up the show with, which is where they were analyzing planes that came back from battle or from war or whatnot, and looking at where all the bullet holes were to try and decide, hey, where should we armor up to help our planes survive? Well, then they realize, oh, wait, the planes that we really should be looking at are the ones that got shot down because those are the ones that needed more armor. The ones that came back, they survived. So that's an example of when survivor bias can happen. But we also pointed out in the episode that survivor does not just mean life or death types of things. It just means somebody or some piece of data was not in the room for that type of thing. So Alexander gave an example of, hey, if you're talking with a company and then talking with the board about the way they do or the executives about the way they do promotions, and the executives don't see anything wrong with the promotions, well, it's like, okay, that's good. And that's not to minimize what those people think, but recognize that those are the people who are in the room. Those are the people who did get promoted. There are a bunch of people who did not, who either didn't get promoted or quit or were fired, that are not a part of that conversation. So those are a couple of examples of survivor bias that we talked about throughout the show. And then Alexandra emphasized that, hey, maybe how can you apply this into your life? Well, first off, just recognize survivor bias as a thing. So as you're consuming information, whether it be from a friend or from a news source or whatnot, think about, okay, they're talking about this. Who was not present or what data was not included in that situation. So step one with pretty much any bias is recognizing that it exists. And even if you or the data scientists or whatnot are taking steps to account for it, the first step is knowing that it exists and it will always be there. So you should always have it in the back of your mind. And then we went a little bit further and suggested, like, hey, if you really want to help minimize the effect of this in your life, intentionally go out and find things that you would not normally be in your circle, would not normally be in your news feed, because, oh, by the way, in case you didn't realize it, your life is curated largely by algorithms. From your search engine to the social media you're on, you are shown things specifically to you. So by definition, there are a lot of things in the world that you are not being shown. And so one of the ways to do that is, one, intentionally seek out people and things that you are not normally shown. And as Alexandra pointed out, when it comes to news sources, maybe that's something you should do as well. And she pointed out you should feel a little bit uncomfortable sometimes because those are things that you may not believe, but it's worth hearing what the other side is talking about and thinking about. And of course, we talked about how most things exist on a spectrum. It's not a 1 or a 0. It's not black and white. Of course, there is a little bit of the middle, right? And so even if you're all the way on one side, we're not saying you need to switch all the way to the other side, but maybe at least listen to the other side, and it'll probably move you a little bit more towards the middle, and who knows what may come from that. We also pointed out that the internet is an amazing way to learn about people who you do not normally run in your circles. Alexandra gave a handful of examples of people you might want to follow, including, there's a guy who does what's it called? Tow truck. You could look it up on YouTube. Tow truck savior or something like that. He takes his tow truck and goes and grabs people from all sorts of different places. She mentioned maybe following a farmer or something like that. But just look at someone who doesn't have your walk of life and learn a little bit about them. Take a walk in their shoes and help that better inform the way the world is, right? It's easy to forget in this largely connected world just how small our view of it can be, and all of the things that shape our brain. And guess what? We have a giant filter here in our head where we're taking in the information that we want through the lenses that we have. So, of course, in tune with a lot of the things we talk about, with what the hell is water is, how can we be aware of those filters, aware of those lenses, and make sure to try on some other lenses every now and then and talk to people who have those other lenses so we can have a better understanding of how the world really works and how the world really is. So this episode was right up the alley of what we're trying to accomplish here with What the Hell is Water. So thank you guys for being here. And our challenge for today, let me see, make sure. Look at where you're getting your information. So yeah, that was the challenge for today. Look at where you're getting your information and try looking at some other stuff. So with that, everyone have a wonderful rest of your hump day, and we will see you guys later.